All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm Santiago Siri. I'm the founder of Democracy Earth Foundation. We are a non-profit organization that started in 2015 with help from Y Combinator, which is a Silicon Valley accelerator that has been researching over the past 5 years democracy for the information age. What are the challenges that we need to address if we are gonna in order to deploy democracies over the internet that are censorship resistant, that have a low cost, that are free and openly available for everyone. And throughout these past 5 years, one of the most interesting phenomenons is everything that has been happening around blockchain-based networks or the use of distributed cryptography. Something that it's worth noticing to understand a little bit of the political context that these technologies are diving into is that in 2019, it was the first year that officially both the President of the United States and the President of China have referred directly to blockchain technology in their words. I think probably Vladimir Putin did it even earlier. But at least last year we have seen Donald Trump in the US not speaking very well of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies and trying to defend the US dollar, whereas Xi Jinping called the Chinese population to start working aggressively on having China become the leaders or the makers of the standard in relation to blockchain technologies, in a similar way that China aimed to become to build the standard on other technologies like 5G and other consumer goods. So this is a bit of an interesting turning point that, for example, the day that Xi Jinping spoke for the first time about blockchains, he did it exactly 24 hours later after the congressional hearing of Mark Zuckerberg testifying in Congress in the United States about the Libra project that is being led by Facebook. So there seems to be an arms race that is probably gonna heat up as we dive into the new decade in relation to how nation states start to try to govern these different protocols that are leading economic life on the internet. Another interesting case is that we have also seen leaders of some dictatorships that have been able to weaponize these technologies in their favor. For instance, North Korea has has been very successful at launching different kinds of ransomware viruses. These are malware that hijacks a computer and encrypts the information in that computer and asks for a ransom to be paid on Bitcoin. One of the most widely spread ransomware attacks in 2018 was a virus programmed in North Korea known as WannaCry that attacked the different key parts of infrastructure in the West, including the national health of the United Kingdom, getting doctors to be away from accessing patient records unless they paid a ransomware using Bitcoin. Another interesting case is Venezuela. Venezuela was probably the first country that announced a cryptocurrency project, but what happened in the dark is that the Venezuelan government has been detecting Bitcoin in their territory by simply looking at the electricity footprint, simply looking at the activity in the grid. And by looking at that activity in the grid, they were able to detect where the miners were, and they threatened the miners. Pretty much all of them have left the country, and they expropriated the mining equipment. And it is known today that the government of Venezuela is probably one of the largest Bitcoin miners out there, So you know, the interesting element here being that these technologies, you know, as a technology, they can, you know, a technology can be designed to have or to certain kind of ideology, but at the end of the day lacks judgment. And certainly we have seen with Bitcoin over the last 10 years a lot of exciting innovations, but at the same time very interesting ways of also weaponizing it to put it into the service of dictatorships like this. So this is not new. We have seen this, how technology has always led to the emergence of new political orders. There's an interesting thesis from the 80s called Imagine Communities that explores how the printing press, for example, enabled the emergence of new communities, of what it's known as, the name of the thesis is Imagine Communities by Benedict Anderson. And the fact that humans gathered this power to print books led to communities from languages rather than language of power. Books printed in Latin. As books started being printed in Russian or in French or in Spanish or in English, this new sense of nationalism grew stronger and led to very powerful changes in the political order in the subsequent centuries. And we're probably witnessing a very similar phenomenon in our days with the internet. Where, you know, as we see these protocols like Bitcoin, Ethereum, IDENA, and different projects that are emerging out there, communities are starting to build around these protocols. And this time, what keeps these communities together is not necessarily physical proximity or that, you know, related on a specific language, but might be proximity. Find behind those who use Bitcoin an ideology more closer leaning to probably libertarian philosophy, or you might find, you know, on the different set of protocols, different types of cultures related to how these protocols work. It's interesting to us at Democracy Earth and the research we do to try to look at the different technologies that are emerging through very diverse ideological lenses. So we try to apply both, let's say, a Marxist view, trying to understand what is happening behind these technologies, and a libertarian view. You know, the book on the right is Sovereign Individuals. It's a very well book published in 1996. It is rumored that when you visit Peter Thiel's house in San Francisco, he would have an entire stack of this book on his library, and he would gift you a copy of The Sovereign Individual. And the thing about this book is that it's very prophetic, probably in a similar way to the Communist Manifesto written in the 19th century, by predicting that as we become a species that is connected through cyberspace and through digital technologies, and we got, you know, the capacity to transact with each other through the use of encryption, the state would have little influence. When, you know, there's this quote here: when technology is mobile and transactions occur in cyberspace, governments will no longer be able to charge more for their services. This was written in 1996. 15 years later, we're starting to witness that reality. The Sovereign Individual tries to apply an information theoretic approach to capitalism, and I like a lot of the Marxist theory tries to find an engine to history, a pattern to history that can help describe what is pushing history forward. And according to these researchers, is the idea of an increasing returns to violence, in the sense that there's always a new technology give a subset of society an advantage over the rest, and when that happens, when that advantage happens, there's a shift in power. And cryptography is pretty much one of those moments. If you look into American legislation, for instance, cryptography is included in the official U.S. munitions list, is under category 13. This means that any software or hardware related to the use of cryptography in the United States is considered a weapon. A couple of examples of what this means is that, for instance, when the PlayStation 2 was launched 20 years ago, Sony had to require a special permit to sell in American soil a device that had over 1 gigaflop of processing capacity. The threshold has been moved throughout the years, but if you have certain level of computation capacity within American territory, you just cannot go out there and sell that device. You will need permit from the military. Another well-known example is when in 1993, the programmer of PGP was at an airport and was detained because the software of PGP itself was considered a weapon under American legislation back then. So one could argue that, technology, let's say cryptography as a weapon, could be protected under the Second Amendment in the United States, being this the amendment of the right to bear arms, an amendment built with the spirit of trying to protect citizens against the abuses of the state, and probably, against a state that has nuclear warheads. There's no better guarantee than cryptography to protect your information rather than guns or rifles. So cryptography is making, is generating a new era of power. And one of the leading challenges that we see as we identify how blockchain-based networks, Bitcoin, Ethereum, and all of these new protocols are emerging is how governance happens. If we look into the dynamics of these networks today, pretty much all of these networks are in some way plutocratic, meaning that usually whoever has more stake in the network, whether that stake is mining capacity or whether that stake is holding tokens, whoever has more stake is the real decision maker. And we have seen decision processes happening over these networks over and over, where people go for a vote with their tokens, and at the last minute, a whale holding a vast amount of tokens tumbles the entire election process in its favor. So the fact that pretty much 100% of the networks, of the cryptographic networks out there, are still ruled under plutocratic structures of power is a matter of concern, because this really limits the social impact that these networks could have in the long run. All of these networks, even Bitcoin itself, have been a political act. If we look into the very first block of the Bitcoin blockchain, you will find this headline from this British newspaper from 10 years ago. And the fact that Bitcoin was deployed in the middle of one of the largest financial crises that we have seen in the last couple of decades speaks of the political intentions that Bitcoin had as a technology itself. But the challenge, as I was saying, is that the fact that Satoshi referred to governance as essentially one CPU, one vote, governance is centered around machines and not people. And although an early blockchain networks were pretty much for anonymity, or try to create more guarantees for anonymous behavior online, the conundrum all of these networks face today is, if we don't find a way to formalize human identity, if we don't find a ways to formalize human identity over these networks, then we risk all of these networks being governed under plutocratic schemes. But at the same time, if we put personal information on these networks, if we put personal information on an immutable ledger, if the context of my government, let's say, suddenly becomes a totalitarian government, then that personal information put on an immutable ledger becomes a risk against me. So the challenges of how we do human identity or how we verify human participants in order to make these networks more democratic is not very straightforward. Last summer in Berlin, Edward Snowden gave a very interesting conference to a whole crowd of hackers that came together during the Web3 summit held in Berlin. And he basically stated two very relevant things about identity. He first said that the one vulnerability being exploited across all systems is identity. And he went on to specify that the challenge that we face is that we need to differentiate between verifying an identity and verifying the right to use a technology. This is a very subtle but very important distinction. Verifying the identity, verifying personal information can always pose a risk, but if we have a way of verifying simply the right to use a technology, then we might have a way forward that will allow us to start creating systems that can address social issues and not just financial issues. So a lot of our research at Democracy Earth is trying to figure out how we do human rights on this type of networks. So we have been researching with a broad group of researchers in the space that belong to different projects and work with different protocols, if a proof of human is possible or not. And there are definitely a lot of very interesting experiences that are going on, which I'll mention briefly. But if we were able to have a proof of human protocol that we can all agree on, then the decentralized applications that would get built on top of this protocol would be the social blockchain. And the social blockchain is being able to implement stuff like democracy, universal basic income, portable credit, and other social applications that might help address challenges that our societies face. Some experiences that have been trying to do this coming from the political angle have been some political parties. There's the Partido de la Red, which is a political party I started with some colleagues and friends in Argentina back in 2012. There are different forks of the Partido de la Red across Latin America. One of them that ran for elections last year is the Partido Digital in Uruguay. Then there's candidates like Andrew Yang in the United States that are promoting universal basic income in the electoral campaign. And here's an interesting slide. I actually added this slide yesterday. A protester showed up at an Andrew Yang meeting in the United States in San Francisco, protesting that Andrew Yang is effectively a robot and that his agenda is an agenda related to favor artificial intelligence rather than having a more humanistic approach. But it is interesting, this sensation that this kind of rhetoric is suddenly becoming, reaching the mainstream politics in the United States, whether is Andrew Yang or not a robot, how we can figure that out. So the challenges of dealing with humans over this type of networks is figuring out how to prevent either becoming Facebook or the Chinese Communist Party, while at the same time making a system that verifies humans without confusing them with artificial intelligence or civil participants. One of the aspects about how identity works is that there are risks by simply defining identity as a one-dimensional pointer in a database. If identity is narrowed down to a username or an email address or a phone number, then that property alone is all it takes to create a surveillance around identities. So thinking about identity as a one-dimensional pointer has a huge risk, and we have seen the outcome of the experiment of the World Wide Web leading us to that, where we are very much often forced at the end of the day to provide legitimacy through a phone number or through an email address. So we might need to start thinking about identity more as a spectrum of possibilities, or something that we can compose with multiple markers or with multiple signals, rather than narrowing down identity to a one-dimensional pointer. That said, there are some very interesting proof of human prototypes. Ongoing experiments are aiming to verify humans over decentralized networks. One of the experiments, a lot of experiments, I would say, are trying to do a web of trust scheme. This is a project led by a team called Kleros. Kleros has implemented an arbitration system to judge for conflict resolution, in order to judge when there's a conflict related to a decision or to a project. They are doing a version of their arbitration system to verify humans on chain. This is a system very much based on a web of trust, and using what is known as a TCR, which means a token curated registry, where the token economics try to punish and reward jurors for verifying valid claims. There are some pros and cons about this. If there are a lot of dishonest participants, they can simply take over the web of trust, and this is a very well-known problem with web of trust. So it poses a big risk if we have a large amount of dishonest participants, and we can expect that if someone wants to, if a system becomes very relevant or underpins significant economic activity, and at the same time putting personal proof or personal evidence that can be addressed to a specific address on the blockchain, also can be risky if there's too much personal evidence related to that in relation to privacy. Another project that is definitely one of our favorites is IDENA. I assume that you have been hearing about this during the conference this last couple of days. But what we like about IDENA is it has a very original approach, diving deep into what differentiates a human from a machine. Basically doing synchronous Turing tests that need to be solved in a party, sorting out these flip exercises. One of the things that I really liked about the IDENA project is that has identified key properties that these Turing tests need to have in order to be machine learning resistant. So these two tests need to be, belonging to the class of AI hard problems. This cannot be about pattern recognition. Anything that is about pattern recognition can be brute forceable. These problems need to be human created, because if something is algorithmically created, then it can be reverse engineered by another algorithm. It needs to be, a kind of CAPTCHA that can be create an infinity set of possible CAPTCHAs and not just a reduced set of CAPTCHAs, and prevent any major systemic vulnerabilities. These are very spot-on features that have been identified by this project. I have been following IDENA for the last, probably since I met Serge in March this year last year in Detroit. So I've been following the project ever since. And it's really interesting that on every new party of verification of the identities, the verified identities keeps growing. I think at the last time we had over 300 identities being verified by the network. So every Saturday there's this moment that participants have to synchronously at the same time solve the reveal tests in order to earn tokens in the network. So definitely one of the projects that it's worth looking for. And there's also some academic work being done. Probably one of the most interesting papers on the subject is this paper called Verifying Identity as a Social Intersection by Nicolene Morlica, Matthew Jackson, and Glenn Weil. Glenn Weil is the author of Radical Markets. He leads the Radical Exchange Movement, which is an organization we work with at Democracies. And they are basically bringing clues of how pre-formal identity works in the social world through intersections, and by looking at the intersections of groups, derive that how we can create identities. This is an approach that we are actually looking into ourselves. There are some projects that have been looking into the idea of looking at group intersections, but it is a promising approach. Some people question whether this would be effectively be able to be implemented in digital form or not. Something that we have been pushed to research recently is taking a probabilistic approach to identity, rather than signaling humanity as a true or false absolute value. Try to create some kind of score that estimates the probability of any given address of being human, being a unique human or not. This is a very challenging problem because at the end of the day, identity is intersubjective. We have objective elements of measurement that define an identity, like let's say, physical attributes and stuff like that. And then there's subjective elements that define what our identity. So it is within this intersubjective space that identity happens. There's the researcher John Searle said that all institutional reality effectively happens in intersubjective space. But our approach, what we're trying to do ourselves is try to find ways of doing objective measurements around the social graph that we see on the activity happening, for example, on the Ethereum blockchain, where we see a lot of what is known as DAOs, distributed autonomous organizations. These digital companies or these digital entities are emerging on the Ethereum blockchain. And we can start looking into these DAOs and start measuring activity around them. And an objective measure that we can do around them is, for example, to try to generate a Gini score for each DAO. On every DAO, we get to see the addresses that are participating and the amount of shares or the amount of tokens that the addresses have in order to participate in a DAO. And by simply calculating the amount of shares and addresses, we can calculate a Gini coefficient for a DAO. And if a Gini coefficient is relatively close to 0, meaning that DAO is egalitarian, we can expect that the addresses participating might be linked to a single human being, being that an objective measurement of this. The subjective measurement is more related to establishing an agreement whether a DAO is trustworthy or not. And each person, each individual might have a personal opinion on which DAOs are trustworthy and which DAOs aren't. So that personal lens, that subjective lens, is a countermeasure to the objective measurements. And in order to that, what we're trying to understand is if an algorithm that uses these two techniques, this objective measurement and this subjective measurement combined together, can help us look at any address on the blockchain and estimate a score that is a probabilistic score that is able to identify if we're interacting with a unique human or not. Now, for this to happen, we need projects like IDENA, like Kleros, like all of the proof of humanity different projects. We even need maybe oracles that connect to the registries of national governments or local governments, because everything, is a potential signal that what we want to foster is not the idea of narrowing down a single address to a single human, but enabling anyone to compose their humanity with multiple addresses according to their needs or to their privacy requirements. So the subjective measurement, one of how we are able to effectively rank DAOs or to effectively rank different pointers that are trying to indicate identity. A technique that we like a lot from a lot of the experimentation we have done with democracy at Democracy Earth. I think we have implemented every possible form of democracy you can think of, that goes from direct democracy, liquid democracy, participatory budgeting, all kinds of voting schemes. One of the most interesting ones is quadratic voting. Quadratic voting is a mechanism where here it's illustrated in 3 steps. Let's say you have a verified identity and every participant in the vote has 10 tokens. If you put 1 vote on an issue, that will cost you 1 token. But if you put 2 votes on an issue, that will cost you 4 tokens. And if you put 3 votes on an issue, that will cost you 9 tokens. So the cost increases quadratically. And this quadratic cost has a consequence that, for the voter, that the voter needs to decide whether she will vote on a single issue and put all of her tokens on that single issue, or distribute a small amount of tokens across many issues. And this is something we see in elections happening all around the world. Most elections are a battle between the weak preferences of the majority and the strong preferences of the minorities. And being able to signal not only your preference, but also the intensity of your preference by introducing an opportunity cost with the quadratic formula, in our experience, has led to good results. An interesting property of quadratic voting, for instance, is that if you apply quadratic voting using Likert scale, where you have strongly disagree and strongly agree on a spectrum of choices, for example, on the lower left, you can see a vote on Obamacare, which is a very polarizing issue in America. And without quadratic voting, you will see that votes tend to go to the extremes, tend to go to the strongly disagree or strongly agree. Whereas with quadratic voting, you have a more organic distribution of the votes reaching closer to the middle. And this is a consistent pattern that we have seen across many issues, where quadratic voting reaches a middle ground. Last year, in 2019, Democracy Earth did the first implementation of quadratic voting for a government in the United States. We worked with the state of Colorado. And we had 41 legislators voting over 107 bills. Each legislator was given 100 tokens, and they had to decide how to prioritize these 107 bills. In 2018, they tried to do participatory budgeting, and they had almost 60 to 70% of the bills having the same amount of tokens. They were not able, in participatory budgeting or direct voting, you just have a big blob of bills with the same amount of tokens, so you cannot really differentiate in the long tail the priorities of the projects being introduced. Whereas with quadratic voting, we have been able to develop, again, an organic distribution of the votes. Of the 107 bills, only 3 bills did not get a single vote, and we were able to pretty much rank from the first position to the last position all of the bills that have been introduced by the legislators in Colorado over the 2019 legislative season. So this is a mechanism that, by allowing to rank a long tail of preferences and not just the top 5 or the top 3 preferences in an election, might be useful to create the subjective side of a consensus mechanism that can help benchmark addresses on a distributed network. With that, I'm finishing my talk. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. You can follow me on Twitter as SantiCity and Democracy Earth as @DemocracyEarth, and you can visit our website democracy.earth to see more about the work we have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Santi. We'll try to take some questions if possible. Can you hear us? Can you hear us, Santi?
Yes, I can hear with a bit of echo, but I can.
Okay. Any questions?
I'm wondering, what are your further plans for Democracy Earth implementations? Like, what are ongoing projects which we are going to test this?
Can you repeat the question? So it was about Democracy Earth implementation?
Yeah, sure. I'm wondering, like, what are the future plans for Democracy Earth? Like, in what direction are you going to work?
So I'll give you a little bit of an overview about our technology. You can look at the repositories on GitHub, github.com/democracyearth. You will find there we have a tool that is, we're pretty much focused on working with the Ethereum community right now. So we are creating a tool that allows to browse and explore DAOs, different autonomous organizations being deployed over Ethereum. We have been collaborating very closely with a project known as Moloch DAO. Moloch DAO is a very simple smart contract that consists only of 400 lines of code, but it has been very successful in terms of getting adoption from large stakeholders of the Ethereum community, precisely because of the simplicity of the smart contract and some specific game theoretic tweaks. What we want to see at Democracy Earth is to see more DAOs being deployed over the Ethereum blockchain, because if we see more DAOs or more institutional activity happening over this network, then that will give us more signals or more clues of how to be able to address or to estimate or to benchmark whether an address is belonging to a unique human or not. We have a working paper on this intersubjective consensus idea. You can look for this paper also in our GitHub repository. It's a work in progress, but you can find it on paper.democracy.earth. And you can try our technology on the Moloch, MOLOCH.democracy.earth. You can play with our technology there. We are also working on a smart contract we called Proof of Humanity, which is an implementation of the Kleros smart contract. So there's a repository also on GitHub. I think this one is github.com/Proof of Humanity. We'll find it there. And this is a fork of the Kleros smart contract that allows, that is being designed to do the TCR, the calculated registry around identities. And this registry requires a governance entity, which we are right now in the phase of designing. But my best recommendation is for you to check our paper and our repositories on GitHub.
Santi, I have a question on the funding side. How do you fund Democracy Earth? How do you do the funding? And what do you think about the recent Gitcoin project?
Funding is not easy. We are a non-profit organization. We believe that we cannot put a price to the right to participate. So we are not your traditional for-profit entity. But that said, throughout the last 5 years, Democracies has raised around a total of $2.2 million. I would say that 60% of that raise has been related to a token that we have offered, a regulated offering in the United States back in 2018, that enabled us to raise through the use of crypto, and the other 40% has been raised through philanthropic grants. We have been very lucky to receive the support from Y Combinator and the Templeton Foundation. Specifically, the Templeton Foundation has been funding our research in relation to proof of humanity, or trying to understand how to formalize humans over decentralized networks. This is an organization that is very much looking into for instance, applying technology for these purposes. But yes. We are a non-profit organization, and we rely today mostly on philanthropic organizations supporting our research.
And what is your take on the Gitcoin recent round? Was it a success for you? Like, how do you think? Gitcoin,
I think it's to me it's interesting to see the Ethereum community supporting each other. For us, it was we raised $1,000, so it's not like we were able to do much with that. We probably can pay for servers and stuff like that, which is pretty good. But the nice thing is, we got more than 60 donors, and it was our first participation in a Gitcoin run. And it's just, I think it's interesting to see now within the Ethereum community, how everyone is supporting each other. And we try to inject ourselves into that community, because there's a lot of very interesting innovations happening in relation to using crypto for more than just trading and financial speculation. And particularly, one of the projects that I'm a part of is Moloch DAO, and in Moloch we're trying to also fund projects that are advancing the public infrastructure of Ethereum. I think it's good to see in these communities attempts to bootstrap itself through the use of technologies that are using, the technology, Ethereum itself.
So maybe one more question.
Sorry?
Yeah, can you hear me? I would like to ask about the Web of Trust approach, building the identity. Do you think it's possible to build the kind of common consensus about the list of humans who are sort of validated on the Web of Trust? Or Web of Trust assumes that it will be always sort of a multiple, sort of sources of truth, and multiple kind of registries of validated identities. Thank you.
So, let me break my volume. I'm not particularly fond of Web of Trust. I think Web of Trust has been happening for the last 30 years, 20 years. It's like not a very new idea. And I agree that there's a severe risk that the Web of Trust needs to reach a certain scale or grow beyond a certain community. Then it can get out of control very easily. I think that we are trapped in somewhat of I'd say like a trade-off. You have the IDENA approach of synchronous field tests, which has a very high coordination cost, which means that every Saturday you need to be there, or whenever the run happens, you have to be synchronized with the rest of the network, and that has a coordination cost, which maybe also limits to who's able to participate in it. But it's a requirement in order to do this proof of personhood. That is, basically attesting minds or consciousness that are trying to solve these puzzles, and the fact that they are solving it is a requirement for these puzzles to be solved in simultaneous in order to prevent civils in the network. There might be some geniuses that could do many of these very quick, but it's an interesting trade-off, this coordination cost. Whereas with Web of Trust theoretically enables asynchronous generation of identity, and asynchronously you have people submitting their proof, and you have validators and judges trying to verify that proof. What's particularly interesting about Kleros is that they have done a lot of research on how to introduce randomization to how the assignation of jurors happens. So the idea of trying to prevent how the judging, trying to prevent the possibility of bribing a juror through the introduction of a lottery mechanism that assigns who's going to be verifying which identity. That could help prevent some ways of gaming the Web of Trust. But I have to say, I still remain skeptical to a lot of these approaches, because we have seen experiments like this in the past. There was an experiment last year called Humanity Now that basically did the same thing, and it was relatively easy to hack. But I think that a lot of these experiments, what we'll probably end up seeing in 5 years from now or 10 years from now, if the relevance of these networks keeps growing, is that we'll have a large constellation of oracles of all kinds. And how we can compose by choosing which oracle verifies me as older than 18 years old, or which oracle identifies me as an Argentine, or and composing an identity could be an interesting identity network. And it goes along the line of stating identity as something closer to a spectrum rather than this one-dimensional pointer that, at the end of the day, if it's a one-dimensional pointer, then it can be subject to some surveillance.